Cowboy watched Apache dragged into Rainfall, and the rising smoke declared justice due. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. James Madison stood at the edge of the weathered cabin, staring out into the storm that seemed to be swallowing the land whole. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain poured down relentlessly, as if the heavens themselves were mourning something long lost. James' eyes narrowed as he watched the silhouette of Takakota, an Apache man he had once called a friend, being dragged through the mud. The struggle was palpable in the air, the harsh rain and the dark figures around him creating an almost surreal scene. He could hear the sound of hooves, the clatter of boots, and the sharp cries of commands in a language he barely understood. Takakota had always been a proud man, strong in spirit and body, and to see him now, pulled through the dirt like a broken animal, stirred something deep inside James. He hadn't seen the Apache in years, not since the days when the land was simpler, when the lines between them hadn't been so stark. But today, those lines were clearer than ever. Takakota had crossed them in ways that no one could ignore, and now, there he was, captured in a moment of shame, of helplessness. James swallowed hard. He had made his choice long ago, living in this remote cabin, far from the violence of the world. He had made peace with it. But now, as he watched the man he once called brother, his blood boiled with the injustice of it all. He could hear the distant rumble of thunder, but it wasn't the storm that caused his heart to race. It was the figure that stood over Takakota, the one who seemed to control everything, the one who seemed to think he had the right to decide Takakota's fate. The man's face was half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. But James could tell he was the leader of this group, the one who had orchestrated this whole affair. James knew what had to happen next, but it was hard to ignore the weight of his decision. He had kept his distance for so long, avoiding confrontation, avoiding the pain of remembering what had once been. But this was different. Takakota wasn't just any man. He was a symbol of everything that had been wrong with this land, a symbol of the past that was far from forgotten. The smoke rising in the distance seemed to signal something more than just the storm. It was as if the very earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the justice that would soon come. As James stood there, he realized that he couldn't just watch anymore. The time for doing nothing had passed. With a deep breath, he turned away from the window, grabbed his rifle, and made his way toward the door. What happened next would change everything, but for now, all he knew was that the moment had arrived. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face it, but he had no other choice. James stepped out into the storm, his boots sinking into the muddy ground with every step. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the landscape into a wash of gray and brown. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the unspoken decision he had just made. There was no turning back now. As he moved forward, the distant figures of the Apache warriors and their captives became clearer. Takakota was still being dragged along, his feet barely touching the ground as he struggled against the hold of the men. The leader of the group, a tall figure with a wide-brimmed hat, gestured toward the captive, barking orders in a language James couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. He was being humiliated, stripped of his dignity, and James couldn't bear to watch any longer. With his rifle in hand, he moved swiftly, his eyes locked on the scene ahead. The tension was palpable, the sound of hooves and boots clashing with the earth creating a rhythmic beat, like the pulse of something much larger than any of them. As James approached, the group of men didn't notice him at first. He knew this moment would be crucial. He had to make his presence known, but he couldn't afford to rush. Takakota's head was low, his posture defeated, but there was still a glimmer of defiance in his eyes. That glimmer was what made James press forward. He had seen it before. Takakota was not a man who would break easily, no matter the circumstances. The storm raged around them, adding a sense of urgency to the situation. The rising smoke from the campfire that had been set nearby swirled into the air, its thick tendrils mixing with the rain and the sound of the wind. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. James took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the rifle as he raised it to his shoulder. The leader of the group turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw James for the first time. A flash of recognition crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced with a cold, calculating expression. He wasn't here to make friends. James could see it in the way the man moved, in the way he sized him up. "What do you want, Cowboy?" The man's voice was low, tinged with hostility, but James wasn't intimidated. "I'm here to make sure this ends the right way," James said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The man laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that seemed to resonate with the surrounding landscape. "The right way?" he repeated, his hand moving toward his belt. "You think you can change what's already been decided?" James didn't flinch. He knew what he had to do. His words were deliberate, carrying a weight that only years of isolation and quiet reflection could give. "I don't think I can change anything. But I do know that justice is something worth fighting for." The leader's smile faded, and for a moment, the wind seemed to die down, as if even nature was waiting for the next move. James didn't wait for the man to make his decision. He stepped forward, his rifle now lowered, but his posture still firm, unwavering. The warriors around him tensed, their hands moving toward their weapons, but they hesitated. Something about James' stance, his calm determination, made them pause. The rain continued to fall, the cold water mixing with the dirt and blood that had already stained the earth beneath them. The smoke from the fire swirled higher, and for a moment, it felt as if the storm itself was reacting to the tension in the air. James' heart raced, but his mind was clear. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to make sure that Takakota's fate would not be decided by the cruelty of men who didn't understand honor. Takakota raised his head, meeting James' eyes with a look of silent gratitude. It was a moment of understanding, a silent pact between two men who had once shared the same land, who had once fought side by side. In that brief exchange, James knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about saving one man. This was about restoring a balance that had been lost long ago. The leader of the group, a man with weathered skin and a cold look in his eyes, took a step back. The warriors surrounding James and Takakota shifted their weight, uncertain. The storm raged on, its intensity adding to the tense atmosphere, but James stood tall, unwavering. His gaze never left the man in front of him, who seemed to be weighing his options. Takakota, though still tired and weathered, watched the exchange with silent resolve. It was clear he was prepared for whatever might come, but James could sense the weariness in him, the fatigue of someone who had fought too many battles. The leader's eyes flickered briefly to the warriors behind him, as if seeking confirmation of what they should do. James could feel the air thick with anticipation. This wasn't just about Takakota anymore. This was about something far bigger. This was about dignity, honor, and what was right. "You think you can just walk in here and stop what's been set in motion?" the leader asked, his voice low but carrying the weight of a command. James didn't flinch. "I don't think I can stop it," he said, his tone firm. "But I'll be damned if I stand by and let it happen." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. There was a long pause, the wind howling around them, the sound of the storm rising and falling like the ebb and flow of tension. The leader's eyes narrowed. "You're alone," he said, almost as if testing James. "Do you really think you can win this fight?" "I'm not alone," James replied calmly, his eyes scanning the surrounding area, as if searching for something. "Not anymore." The leader's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face for just a moment. Then, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance, and the group of Apache warriors surrounding them shifted, looking toward the horizon. James turned just in time to see a silhouette approaching through the rain, a figure riding through the storm with purpose. The man on horseback was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen and experienced it all. As he neared, the leader of the group straightened, his expression shifting to one of recognition. The man on horseback came to a stop beside James, his eyes scanning the scene before him. There was no need for words. The presence of this new figure, calm and collected, spoke volumes. The leader's expression faltered, uncertainty creeping into his demeanor. James didn't need to look back to know who had arrived. Takakota's eyes locked with his, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The warriors surrounding them began to shift uneasily. They had expected a confrontation, but this was different. The arrival of a new player, a new force, changed everything. The storm had done its part, intensifying the emotions swirling around them, and now, with the arrival of the new figure, the game had shifted entirely. "This is between you and me," the man on horseback said, his voice low but resolute. "The rest of you should leave." His gaze swept over the warriors, who seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to proceed. The leader took a step back, his hand twitching toward his weapon, but there was no aggression in his movement, only hesitation. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had frozen. James could sense the change in the air, the shift in power. He had no doubt that this moment would define everything that followed. And as the warriors began to retreat, one by one, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief mixed with uncertainty. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But it was a start. The leader, now backed by the presence of the man on horseback, gave one last, searching look before turning and signaling his men to follow. Slowly, they faded into the storm, leaving James and Takakota standing together, the tension in the air dissipating but not entirely gone. James watched them disappear into the distance, then turned to Takakota, his heart still pounding with the weight of what had just unfolded. This wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. But for now, they had survived. And that, in itself, was a victory. James stood quietly, watching as the last of the warriors disappeared into the storm. The rain continued to fall, but the tension in the air had loosened, leaving a strange sense of calm behind. Takakota was still by his side, but there was something different about him now. He wasn't the broken man that had been dragged through the mud. There was a quiet strength in his posture, as if the storm had not only washed away the dirt but also the weight of years of hardship. James felt a strange kinship in that moment, understanding that they had both been through trials that had shaped them in ways words could never fully express. Takakota glanced at James, his dark eyes steady but filled with unspoken gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and rough, but with an intensity that held more meaning than the simple words could convey. James nodded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "We both know what's at stake," he replied, his voice steady, though the weight of the moment was still heavy in his chest. The figure on horseback had left without a word, but his presence had been enough. He had done what needed to be done, without a show of force, without a single shot fired. The storm had passed, but James knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much left to unfold, so many questions yet unanswered. Takakota shifted slightly, his eyes moving over the now empty space where the warriors had stood moments before. The silence was deafening. "They will return," Takakota said quietly, his voice distant, as if he were thinking of something far beyond the immediate present. James didn't respond at first. He had heard the words before, but this time, they felt different. The looming threat was no longer a distant possibility. It felt real, tangible. It was only a matter of time before those who had been defeated came back with a vengeance. "We'll be ready," James said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty that matched the fire in his heart. It wasn't a promise. It was a simple truth. They had no other choice. As the rain slowly began to ease, James turned toward his cabin, his boots sinking slightly in the mud with each step. Takakota followed, moving with the grace of a man who had seen much, but who carried himself with the dignity of someone who had not yet given up. James glanced at him, sensing a deep shift in the air. Something had changed in both of them. The past could never be undone, but there was still a chance for redemption. "You know," James began, his voice thoughtful as they reached the door, This land's been broken for a long time. But maybe it doesn't have to stay that way. Takakota didn't reply immediately. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They both knew what it would take to make things right, to mend the fractures that had run deep for so long. It would require more than just fighting. It would take understanding, trust, and a willingness to build something new from the ashes of the past. The wind had stopped, and the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a pale, golden glow over the land. It was a new day, and though the road ahead was uncertain, James and Takakota both knew that it was a road they would walk together. As the door to the cabin creaked open, James paused, turning to look one last time at the horizon. The storm had passed, but the war was far from over. And as the sunlight began to break through the clouds, he couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in a long while, there was hope. A small but steady flame, flickering in the distance, waiting to be nurtured. The days following the storm were quiet, but the air was thick with anticipation. James and Takakota spent the next few days preparing for what was inevitably coming. James worked the land during the day, his movements steady and deliberate, though his mind was never far from the events that had unfolded. Takakota remained close, but there was a distance in his gaze, as if he were always watching, waiting for something. There was a tension in the air that neither of them could shake. It was the calm before the storm, and they both knew it. The distant mountains loomed like silent sentinels, and every time the wind rustled through the trees, it carried a whisper of what might be coming. The two men had built a silent understanding between them. Takakota, though a man of few words, had a presence that spoke volumes. He was a man who had seen more than his share of violence, but his calm demeanor betrayed the deep strength within him. James often caught him staring into the distance, as if calculating the path of the storm that was about to hit. On the 5th day after the rain had stopped, a rider appeared on the horizon. The figure was distant at first, a silhouette against the pale sky. But as he drew closer, James recognized the man. It was the rider from the storm, the one who had come to their aid. The one who had changed the course of everything. The man was alone, riding with the same purpose that James had seen in his eyes before. He approached the cabin slowly, his horse's hooves barely making a sound on the wet earth. Takakota, who had been standing at the edge of the porch, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched the rider's approach. The man came to a stop a few feet away, his horse shifting nervously beneath him. There was a tension in the air, but it wasn't the kind of tension that came from fear. It was the kind that came from something more profound, respect. "James," the rider said, his voice low but steady. "Takakota." The two men nodded in unison, acknowledging the unspoken bond between them. The rider dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the mud as he walked toward them. He looked at Takakota, then back at James, his eyes lingering on them both. "It's time," he said simply. James nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. He had known it would come to this, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. There was no turning back now. "You know what we have to do," the rider continued, his voice calm but resolute. Takakota stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but his posture straight and proud. "I have been ready for this," he said, his voice steady, as if he had made peace with the inevitable. James looked between the two men, then turned his gaze to the land. Around them, the quiet of the valley seemed to press in on them, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It was in these moments, in the stillness before action, that the weight of history felt the heaviest. "We're ready," James said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Let's make it right." The rider gave a single nod, and with that, the three men turned toward the horizon. The storm had passed, but the fight was just beginning. Together, they would face what was to come, not with the weight of fear or doubt, but with the strength of those who knew they were fighting for something greater than themselves. As they walked into the setting sun, the world around them seemed to hold a quiet promise, one of justice, of redemption, and of the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this time the land would heal. The journey had been long, the landscape shifting from the familiar, rolling hills to the rugged, unforgiving terrain that marked the edge of the wild frontier. James, Takakota, and their companion rode side by side, the silence between them comfortable, but filled with the weight of what was to come. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the vast expanse, but it was the stillness of the land that seemed to speak the loudest. Every mile they covered seemed to pull them deeper into the heart of a conflict they had no control over, but they knew they had no choice but to face. The man on horseback, who had silently guided them thus far, had never spoken much, but his presence was a steady force. James had learned to read him in the short time they had traveled together. He was a man of few words, but those words were always deliberate. Takakota, too, was quiet, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held the sharpness of a man who had lived through more than most could ever imagine. It was the kind of silence that only comes from knowing the full weight of history, from understanding the consequences of every action. As the three of them rode, the world around them seemed to close in. The distant mountains loomed like ancient guardians, but the land between them was treacherous and unfamiliar. There were no signs of civilization here, no settlements, no roads, only the raw, untamed wilderness that had once been home to Takakota's people. James felt the weight of the land beneath him, each step of his horse sinking deeper into the earth, as if the land itself was remembering, holding on to the past in ways that words could never fully explain. Takakota's horse moved with the ease of someone who had spent his life in the saddle, and despite the distance they had traveled, his posture never faltered. James couldn't help but notice the quiet strength in him, the resilience that had been forged through years of struggle. They rode for hours, the sun sinking lower, until the sky darkened, and the first stars began to appear. The world seemed to settle into a calm, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. As night fell, they made camp in a small clearing, the fire crackling softly in the center. The warmth from the flames was a welcome relief from the chill that had settled in the air. James sat quietly by the fire, his thoughts swirling around the decisions they had made and the ones they were about to face. The quiet was broken by the sound of Takakota's voice, low and measured. "They will not stop," he said, his words simple, but heavy with the weight of truth. James looked at him, the flickering firelight casting shadows across his face. "I know," he said quietly. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves, a reminder that the journey ahead would not be without danger. Takakota's gaze never wavered from the fire, but there was something in his eyes that James couldn't quite place, a quiet determination, perhaps, or the acceptance of what was to come. "We will fight," Takakota continued, his voice steady. "But not for revenge. For justice." James nodded, understanding exactly what Takakota meant. It wasn't about fighting for the sake of fighting. It was about something deeper, something that transcended the violence and pain of the past. It was about doing what was right, even when the odds were stacked against them. The fire crackled again, sending a burst of warmth into the night air. James looked around at the land, at the darkened sky, and for a brief moment, he felt as though everything had slowed, as if the world had paused to allow them this moment of clarity. "We'll do what we must," James said finally, his voice firm with conviction. The wind shifted, and the air felt cooler, but the fire burned brighter in response. Takakota's eyes met his, a silent understanding passing between them. The storm that had been brewing in the distance was closer now, and they both knew it. But for the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of resolve. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something greater. As the fire burned low, they settled in for the night, knowing that the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But they were ready. They had no other choice. The morning came quietly, the sky still gray from the previous storm. The air had a fresh, crisp feel to it, a reminder that nature had a way of cleansing itself. James woke early, the remnants of the fire still glowing softly as the embers crackled. Takakota was already up, standing at the edge of the clearing, staring out into the distance. James watched him for a moment, wondering what was going through his mind. There was something about the way Takakota stood, so still and quiet, that reminded him of the land itself, ancient, steadfast, and unwavering. It was clear that the Apache man was accustomed to these moments of solitude, moments where the weight of the world didn't press in as heavily. But James could feel the weight just the same. They had come far, but the journey was far from over. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, but the scent of the wood lingered in the air, mixing with the freshness of the rain-soaked earth. James stood up, stretching his back, and grabbed his rifle, checking it quickly. His movements were deliberate, practiced, but his mind kept drifting to what lay ahead. The quiet was only a temporary lull before the storm that was sure to come. As Takakota turned back to the camp, James caught his eye. They didn't need words. They both knew what was coming, knew what they would face together. Takakota nodded once, then spoke in a voice that was low but steady. "The land is patient," he said. "It waits for us to make our move, but it will not wait forever." James nodded in agreement. He knew the truth of Takakota's words. The land was a silent witness to the history that had unfolded here, and now, they were part of that history. There would be no more running, no more hiding. It was time to face what had been set in motion. They packed up their things quickly, moving with the efficiency of men who had done this many times before. The horses were saddled, and the camp was left behind, the smoke from their fire still hanging in the air like a fleeting memory. As they rode, the landscape began to change once more. The open plains gave way to dense forests and rocky terrain, the path becoming more treacherous with each mile. The silence between them grew heavier as the terrain became more unforgiving, and James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every sound seemed to echo louder than it should, and every step felt like it carried more weight than it did the day before. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. Takakota's eyes scanned the surroundings with the same intensity James had come to recognize. His gaze was sharp, constantly alert, never missing a detail. James couldn't help but feel the weight of his own unease. They were getting closer, but to what, exactly? The sound of hooves echoed in the distance, but it wasn't the thunderous stampede of a herd. It was the unmistakable rhythm of riders, moving swiftly, deliberately. James instinctively pulled his horse to a stop, his hand on the reins as he listened. Takakota did the same, his posture tense, his eyes narrowing. The riders were coming from the east, moving fast and in formation. It wasn't a scouting party, this was something more deliberate, more dangerous. James felt a knot form in his stomach. This was it. The moment they had both known would come. Takakota's voice broke the silence, calm and resolute. "They are here." James nodded, gripping his rifle tightly, his pulse quickening. He had known this was coming, but now that it was here, the reality of it settled in like a heavy stone. They would face it together. There would be no running, no retreating. It was time to stand. Slowly, they turned their horses, moving to higher ground where they would have the advantage. The riders were closing in, the sound of their approach unmistakable. Takakota glanced at James, a brief but knowing look. Passing between them? No words were needed. They both understood the stakes. This wasn't just about survival. It was about ensuring that the land they fought for would remain theirs, that the justice they sought would be delivered. The riders came into view, their faces grim, their horses moving with precision. There was no hesitation in their movement. The showdown was imminent, and everything James had been preparing for in his heart and mind was about to unfold. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it. The fire inside him was lit, and there would be no turning back. The riders came closer, their horses moving with the practiced precision of men who knew what they were doing. The air around James and Takakota seemed to grow heavier, the wind picking up once more, carrying the smell of wet earth and the distant crackle of lightning. James could hear the pounding of hooves, growing louder with each passing second. Takakota sat still beside him, his eyes narrowed, scanning the riders as they approached. There was no fear in his gaze, only a calm determination. James felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. The time for talking had passed. The riders finally came into view, their faces grim and their expressions unreadable. They were a group of 5, moving as one, with the leader at the front. The leader's eyes met James for a brief moment, but there was no recognition in them, only the cold calculation of a man who had his orders. The others behind him were silent, their horses moving in sync as they followed their leader. James felt the tension building, a quiet energy in the air as they stopped just a few yards away from the two of them. The world seemed to slow for a moment, the silence between them thick and heavy. "You are trespassing," the leader said, his voice deep and measured, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that betrayed the tension he was holding back. "This land is ours," James said, his voice steady, but with an underlying force. "And we will defend it." The leader looked at him for a moment longer, then glanced at Takakota. The recognition finally flickered in his eyes, but it was fleeting. "You've made a grave mistake," the leader said, his tone shifting slightly. "This land belongs to those who take it, not to those who defend it." James' grip on his reins tightened, but he didn't move. He wasn't going to start a fight, not unless it was necessary. He had made that choice long ago. But Takakota had his own sense of justice, his own quiet strength, and James could feel the tension in the air shift. "We have taken nothing," Takakota said, his voice low but firm. "We have only kept what is ours." The leader's gaze hardened, and he shifted in his saddle, signaling the others behind him to move forward. But it was not with aggression, it was with a measured calm, as if testing the waters, seeing how far they could push before something would break. James could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. This was it, the point where everything would change. "There is no need for this," James said, his voice calm but firm. "We don't want trouble. But we will not back down." For a moment the leader said nothing, his eyes scanning both men, as if deciding whether to push forward or back off. James knew that they were on the brink, a single decision away from a conflict either of them wanted but both of them were prepared for. Finally the leader sighed, a slight movement of his shoulders, as if resigning to the inevitability of the situation. "Then you leave us no choice," he said quietly, signaling for the group to dismount. The decision had been made. James and Takakota, standing side by side, prepared for what was to come, their resolve unshaken. They were not here to fight for glory or revenge, but for the land they called home. And in that moment, as the group dismounted, James understood that the fight ahead was not just theirs. It was a fight for what was right, for justice, and for the future that they would carve from the land itself. The group dismounted, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were preparing for something inevitable. James and Takakota stood their ground, both men focused, but there was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken agreement that this moment was not one of violence, but of resolution. The leader of the riders stepped forward, his face hardening as he looked at James and Takakota. "This doesn't have to be how it ends," he said, his voice still calm, but with a trace of something colder beneath it. "But we won't walk away from this land without a price." James looked him in the eyes, feeling the weight of the words. He could sense the challenge, the pressure to decide who would hold the land and who would be forced to give it up. "We're not the ones who started this," James replied quietly, his voice carrying the same steady resolve. "We've done nothing but defend what was never yours to take." The leader's gaze flickered to his men, then back to James, as if searching for something, an opening, perhaps, or a sign of weakness. But there was none. Takakota stood still, his posture unwavering, and his eyes locked on the leader with quiet intensity. It was clear that he had no fear of what might come next. "The land belongs to those who honor it," Takakota said, his voice calm but filled with the weight of generations of wisdom. "You may take it, but it will never truly belong to you." The leader stared at him for a long moment, then sighed, as if the words had hit him harder than he expected. "You speak of honor," he said. "But where is the honor in standing against those who would take what is theirs?" James stepped forward slightly, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his rifle, though he made no move to draw it. "Honor is what you decide it is," he said. "But we've made our choice. And we'll protect this land, no matter the cost. The leader's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was an almost imperceptible shift in the air, the calm before the storm, as if the very earth was holding its breath. The tension was thick, palpable, as the two sides stood at a standoff, either willing to back down. But then the leader took a step back, his gaze shifting briefly to his men, as if making a final decision. Then we'll leave, he said, his voice measured. But know this, you've made a powerful enemy today. And the land may be yours for now, but things have a way of changing. With that, he turned, signaling for his men to mount their horses. Slowly, they began to gather their things, their eyes still wary, but their movements controlled. Takakoto didn't move, his eyes never leaving the leader as they rode away. James watched them go, feeling the tension slowly begin to ebb away, though the weight of what had just transpired hung heavy in the air. We've won for now, Takakoto said quietly, his voice steady. James nodded, but the victory didn't feel like much of one. He knew that the road ahead was still uncertain. But we've only just begun, James said, his eyes scanning the horizon. The land had been defended, but the battle for it was far from over. The storm had passed, but the clouds still loomed on the horizon, and James knew that this was only the first chapter in a much longer story. They didn't speak further as they turned their horses and began to ride back to the cabin. The quiet was broken only by the sound of their horses' hooves on the wet earth, the distant calls of birds overhead, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. As the sun began to set behind them, casting a warm orange glow over the land, James couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. They had faced the storm together and survived. But the storm was not over yet. And when it came again, they would be ready. Because this land, this place they called home, was worth fighting for.